This is all crucial to understanding why you want to make the device. Okay. So, prior to 1993, the way people were handled who had diabetes was the following. You go to the doctor, of course, they do all the tests and everything, and then there was one group of doctors that said, okay, you've got to weigh every ounce of food you eat. You've got to write down every little detail, everything you weigh. You know, everything that goes into your mouth has got to be recorded, and your mother's going to take care of that. You know, and that was the way life went for that group. And then there's another group of doctors that said, you know, I don't think that helps at all, and I don't want to hassle a patient to do all this kind of stuff. You know, just try to let them get going in life, and you know, they might do better in the long run if we don't make such demands on them. Okay. And the reason those two large groups of physicians could stand their ground because there was no conclusive evidence either way. So there have been 135 tests, clinical trials, prior to 1993 to try and resolve the question, does better glucose control lead to less complications? Okay? Because, well, we know they go together, but they could be on the same gene, you know, they could be just coincidental things that co-vary, but they don't have necessarily have a cause and effect relationship, right? So if you control your glucose by weighing out everything, it may not, it's just coincidental. That's going to happen to you anyway, all these problems, right? So this couldn't be answered correctly, right? And you had physician groups who were extreme advocates of their approach, whichever one it was, extreme control or just get by, you know, control. And neither one of them could convince the other group with any scientific data. So, and the reason was that all the previous trials were these retrospective studies, okay? You have patients who actually have pretty good weight management and glucose control, and oh, incidentally, they have pretty good microvascular result, right? You have this other group of patients, okay, they haven't been taking care of themselves so well, they have a less than great result, right? But it was all retrospective, okay? So they got together, and this started in 1973, and they said, okay, we've got to have this new kind of trial. It's a prospective trial. It's called the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial. And the question is, does poor glucose control cause complications? It seems like a really basic thing, because if you can control glucose and it does cause complications, then you get rid of complications. Okay, if it doesn't, well, then go through another plan, right? So this is the question. And so they took 1,400 type 1 patients, all these ages, randomly assigned them to a particular conventional control method where you give a certain amount of insulin a day, you eat a certain amount of food, and you do intended to get you to a certain level of control. Not necessarily the best, but it was randomly assigned either really good control, moderate, or not so hot. Okay, something like that. They use better words than that. So, you know, you were assigned one of these protocols. And by that time, somebody pointed out that, you know, we don't have a good way of knowing what your glucose is, but they had discovered by 1980 that hemoglobin A1C, this 3-month blood glucose average method, instead of, you know, minute-by-minute blood glucose, can give you a good average idea of how good your glucose control was. So you go along for 6 months on that method here, and then they'd say, okay, now it's time to change to protocol, this other protocol where you have really tight control. Do that for 6 months, you know, and then they're looking at the retina all this time, right? Trying to figure out if your retina's microcirculation is changing, or did it get better, or did it go worse? They couldn't really, you know, do biopsies on the kidneys to see that. Most people didn't go for that idea too much, so they use retinas. And it was a prospective study, okay? That means cause and effect. This is an important point here. Cause and effect kind of study. Glucose causes this effect, okay? As opposed to just goes along with it or correlates with it. So it was a cause and effect study, and it was as opposed to the old-fashioned retrospective studies, which can only do correlations at best. So this is a fundamentally different kind of thing. You know, they had questions, well, what about smokers? Do they get diabetes? Well, get all that stuff out of the way. What about obese people? Out of the way. All these other things, you know, they just wanted to focus on glucose control, and they had all kinds of, you know, disqualifiers for people who weren't the right subject for this. And they studied retinopathy, Now, it was to go on for 20 years, 1973 to 1993. But when they started doing this, it was so obvious that people who had poor glucose control had lousy retinas, okay, that they actually had to stop the study early. You know, that's not done normally. You know, you go to the end of this study, and that's, you know, it's the only way we can think about it. But it's not ethical just to go, you know, keep going with this. It was so obvious. And the ophthalmologist had a big catalog of things that appear in your eye when your glucose control is bad. Not only blood vessel damage, but you get all kinds of spots and stars and detachments and all kinds of things that start happening in your eye. All tied into basement membranes in some way, you know. But so this study was terminated early. It's just unethical to keep going on with that study. The other part of it, the nephropathy study, you know, you couldn't, the neuropathy study, they went the full course, and the effect looked weaker, and the assay was not so easy to do in most cases. Now, there have been a whole bunch of other studies that have the same prospective aspect to them and have continued on with these and have confirmed these results. Okay? So here's the central dogma of treatment in diabetes, the Diabetes Control and Complication Trial results for retinopathy. This was published in 1996. And this axis has the hemoglobin A1C, or glycosylated hemoglobin, which is a surrogate for glucose, blood glucose. Excuse me, I'm standing in front of you. Okay. And this side has the rate per 100 year of people getting retinopathy. Okay? And this is the relationship, not the correlation. It's a causal effect thing. You know, if you're moving glucose up this way, this is where it's going to be, right? It's not just a correlated relationship. It's now proven to be a cause and effect kind of relationship. This is a big piece of information. This is the central dogma in diabetes therapy ever since. That means if you can get your glucose to go back down this way, your complications are going to go down to essentially nothing. Okay? And if you don't do that and you're out of control and your glucose goes way up here, you're going to have big time complications. And this is accepted by all clinicians now. There's no two sides of the story anymore. The guys who were insisting their patients weigh every ounce of food they eat, you know, they won. And the other guys that said everything's okay, you know, it doesn't matter, they lost. Okay, and that's the end of that story now. So that's agreed upon. Okay, so this is all getting to why we're going to make a glucose sensor here. Okay.
I just didn't realize this data was also recent. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, there's another 200 studies since '96 that have the same kinds of you know, slightly different variants on it, but they're prospective studies, and different organs and different groups expanded to all kinds of smokers or obese or, you know, all these different groups and so on. It's so rock solid, there's absolutely no discussion. It's the standard of care. Every doctor now has to tell their patient, you will control your blood glucose, okay? They can't say, oh, do your best. They say, control it, okay? Because that's the way it works, okay? No question now. So that's all. That's the same story here. Okay, so I don't want to just go through and show you all my slides here, but so I'm going to skip this one for the moment. That is why, that leads to the motivation of if you're going to control glucose, one thing you need to do is measure it, okay? How do you know, right? And then, of course, the other way is, we've got to have some way, once we measure it, we know we're out of control, then we've got to have some way of driving it back to control. So that's the basis of all therapies in diabetes. Any way you want to do it, they're all tied into that question. Okay? Whether it's type 1 or type 2, doesn't matter. Well, maybe I will show this slide here, since this is the natural. Sorry, I don't want to go through the whole story again. But, that slide just shows, you know, a simple-minded engineer's view, which I claim to be, of blood glucose control. Okay, so what you need is something, either a natural system that works this way, or a mechanical, or a chemical, or a cellular repair system that works this way. So it's got to have a glucose sensor. Okay, you better know that. This is the body, and that, of course, the glucose sensor detects the glucose in the body. And to a first approximation, it behaves like a set point controller. Okay, so your blood glucose is normally about 100 milligrams percent. Except when you have a big meal, then it goes up, right? But most of the time it'll come right back down to about 100, and that's what people can think of as a set point. And so if you eat a pizza, I figure it's here, that's going to cause your blood glucose to rise. The sensor's going to know that. It's going to compare with the 100 value that it's supposed to be at. And if this is bigger than that, then there's error. This is the way the control engineers define the error. Okay? The actual value is different than the set point value that you wanted. And so that error goes into some kind of a control algorithm or control law, which is just a set of rules that says, okay, your glucose is too high, squirt out some insulin, and then that'll make it go down. But that's a simple control law. Okay, there's dynamics and much more fancy version of that and so on. But this is the controller that fights to get your blood glucose to go back down after you eat a pizza. Okay? And you know, this is the normal pancreas here. This is embedded someplace in the pancreas in some fashion. The sensor's on the membrane of the beta cell and so on. Now, if you can make a mechanical version of this, an insulin pump, you know, mechanical pump, make a mechanical sensor or some kind of electrical sensor, and of course you can write down control law to indicate how that to work. That's one way to go. But you can use cells. You know, there might be cells that, say the islets themselves can be taken out of people who, you know, recent cadavers and so on. Put them in people who need islets. They would work this way. You could use stem cells.
Where would you put the insulin pump? Because I thought just a couple minutes ago you said that most surgeons don't like to touch the pancreas.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a big issue.
Okay.
So yeah, just think of why it's a big problem. Okay, suppose you have a real fancy mechanical thing that pumps insulin, it's got a glucose sensor on it, everything's really slick, right? The problem is insulin goes from the pancreas and it goes through the portal vein to the liver.
Okay.
And I haven't told you this part of the story yet, but the liver takes away 90% of the insulin. So leaving the liver, there's only 10% left, and that goes to the rest of the body. Okay. And so there is and it turns out that if you do it the other way around and you deliver insulin to the body first, and then a small amount goes to the liver, everything gets all screwed up. Okay. And why does the liver extract 90% of the insulin? We don't know this. Why is it essential that you know? So that's the way it works. Mother Nature, another mystery, right? So think of why that's a problem. So you have your fancy mechanical machine. You're going to stick it in your abdomen someplace here. Where is the insulin going to go? Okay. Well, suppose you can't put it in the bloodstream in the portal vein, because the last thing you want is for that thing to get damaged or clotted off or something to go wrong, and then you have a big liver that's going to die. You know. So that won't work. So they put it in the peritoneal cavity, right? And you can deliver insulin to the peritoneal cavity, and it can absorb in all those blood vessels around in the peritoneal cavity. Eventually, they get carried away into the portal vein, into the liver. That would work great. But you know, for example, in transplant, which is one way of fixing this, the problem is that you've got to get rid of those endocrine proteins. I'm sorry, the exocrine proteins, the proteins that digest your food. So there's a plumbing problem. You've got to connect up the plumbing to get the endocrine cells, the exocrine cells, all the digestive proteins back into your gut, okay? Because those are pretty powerful and they can simply eat you up, basically, right? But at the same time, the insulin's got to go into the portal vein. So that's the way the pancreas is naturally organized. And it's now very clear that people who give themselves insulin by injection end up having too high a level of insulin in the peripheral tissues, and by the time it makes its way around to the liver, it's way too small. It's completely backwards from the way nature works. And there's big concern that that's one of the big problems. You know, this is a high level thing, but it's after many years of sort of doing it the wrong way, there's going to be some problems with that. So this is a great question, how to put it in there and so on. So anyway, you need some kind of machinery, you know. You need a target. This is the set point. This is where you think it needs to be. Now, why is that on here? You know, everybody would know what that is. I don't know. Okay. It turns out that my graduate student Troy Bremer discovered that we didn't know what the blood glucose target was, okay, until 1999. So Troy went to the library and just found all the previous literature and tried to find where blood glucoses have been measured frequently enough so you could actually follow their excursion. So he found this group in Edmonton, Canada, 1970s. They had a whole bunch of patients. They put a catheter in their arm. They draw bloods from them every 2 minutes, right? Night and day. This went on for 48 hours. And they followed in detail all the blood glucose excursion of these patients, right? And so they had 37 diabetic patients and they had 2 non-diabetic patients, right? There was no other work done between 1970 and 1999 on this question, right? So all the so-called normal blood glucose excursions were based on 2 non-diabetic patients in the 1970 trial. Okay. So Troy, we wrote a paper. We posted this paper in the journal Diabetes, and the NIH got all excited about this and made the DirectNet study. I don't know if you're familiar with that one or not. Yeah, the DirectNet study, we said, okay, we're going to get these 5 universities, make a consortium. The study was pretty interesting. They wanted to study children, because these 2 patients that were non-diabetics were us old people, right? And so most kids are the ones that need to have their blood glucoses known and controlled. So they divided the cohort into 4 groups, 0 to 2-year-olds, okay, 2 to 7, 7 to 14, and 14 to 18 were the 4 groups, okay? And what they would do is the parents would bring the child into the clinic, they'd put a little catheter in their arm. The mother would sample blood every 20 minutes, 15 minutes, like that, all day long, all night long. And this went on for 1 day. And they got to have a free laptop to do that, right? So there was incentives in those days. Laptops were more important than nowadays, right? And so the mother would add all this data into the laptop. And then at the end of 1 day, they take this out, the kid go home and return to normal life. And 6 months later, they return, okay? So they collected all this data on diabetic children, showing their blood glucose in detail excursions. And to enter a child into that trial, you had to have another sibling in the family who was non-diabetic, who had to be in the trial also. Okay, so they had children, siblings of these children, same story. They go there for 1 day every 6 months, mother sampling away. And so we actually collected data on non-diabetics for the first time. And this is in the year 2000 when this actually got going. I mean, as an engineer, the first thing you don't want to know is, what's my target? How am I going to control this? Okay, pick the target. Well, that wasn't known. Yeah, normal people have blood glucose excursions. Okay, and this is sort of the state of the art. So that's necessary, obviously. Control criteria is the question. Well, how close do you have to actually be to that set point of those control values in order to really have the effect? That part's still unknown. Okay. You've got to get really close control. It's going to be hard. And can you tolerate some, distance from control? How much distance do you tolerate? We don't know that yet. And this, if you make a mechanical gadget, it's great because you can adjust all these things later. As people age, or they lose weight, or they gain weight, or they go into a different lifestyle, whatever, you can adjust the control law easily enough. It's not so easy with cells and tissues and transplants to adjust the control law. So something like that is what's needed. Okay. Now this is the hyperglycemic controller, right? Fights hyperglycemia.
Do we know anything about the rate of excursion away from the normals? Is it different between a diabetic and a non-diabetic
Big time.
person? So is that a measure we could use also?
Yes. Just since you asked that, I think. Oh wait a minute. I'll have to go through a whole set of slides to answer. I'll just answer your questions. The answer is the rate is quite different in diabetic and non-diabetic, but that upward going rate depends on your digestive system. The downward going rate is way different, and that's the one that counts as far as diagnosis. But there is a little difference in the upward rate because most diabetics have some deterioration of their digestive system as part of its microcirculation problem. So, but that's known. That's well defined now, very well known. So here's a picture. This, I'm sorry, this is fuzzy, but this guy is Arnold Kadish. Okay, and he lived in Pasadena in 1965, and he made an artificial pancreas. Okay, and this is it. It's a backpack version of it. You know, he had a suitcase version also, and it had a battery in there, and it had a little pumping system that would draw blood. He had a catheter in his arm, you know, and it draw blood through this catheter, pump away, and then it had another catheter, it goes to the other arm, that would squirt in insulin, and he marched around Pasadena way before his time. You know, this is really a remarkable thing at the time. And he made various versions, suitcase version, and all this kind of thing. And this picture I'm just showing you because this is given to me by my postdoc mentor back in the mid-70s. Okay, when I was a postdoc back at Boston. He said, "Okay, go make one of those. All right, this is an artificial pancreas here. It's got a this is what they imagined it to be in those days. A glucose sensor here, power supply, computer. You know, those in those days, computer was, oh, what could that be? You know, pump. That was probably easy in those days. And then here's a reservoir with a rubber septum on here, and then when you pump out all the insulin, then you use a needle and refill it with insulin, right? That kind of thing. So this was a dream in those days, you know, because we didn't have any of it. We didn't have a glucose sensor. There were power supplies, you know, these Sears die-hard batteries, you know, they were being built in those days, right? Computers in the 70s, you know, that wasn't, that was just a dream. And this part here, the pumping and the insulin reservoir part, you could actually make in those days, right? But, so the guy said, okay, go make one of those, and this is what we would like to have, and it's going to be implanted under the skin, and it's got to be small and convenient, and this would solve most of the problems, okay? And so that's been what I've been trying to do for a long time. It seems like a simple enough thing, and I'm not the only one that's tried it. Okay, there's many, many people that tried this kind of thing, right? Some version of it. But I've been working on the glucose sensor part, and other people have had insulin pumps available actually since the mid-80s. But they have not used them because they were worried that they would deliver too much insulin and drive the patient into hypoglycemia, rather than it was down too low and kill them. Okay, and then of course that would be the end of their company, right? And the whole field stopped at that point because of legal issues. Right? So nobody dared to make a insulin pump that operated without a glucose sensor implanted in that fashion. So if you had a glucose sensor, what can you do with it? Well, in type 1 diabetes, you can monitor hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is where you gave a little too much insulin, it causes your glucose to go down. And the problem is if your blood glucose goes from 100 down to 40, if you get to 40, you lose consciousness, okay? And 40 to 60, you lose judgment, okay? And therefore you can't really take care of yourself. You go below 40, you're going to die, basically, okay? And you know, this is a problem. Hypoglycemia is a problem because if you pay close attention to the news in San Diego, you'll see that every 2 weeks somebody dies in hypoglycemia in San Diego. And what do? Well, they drive their car into a restaurant, or they crash into a tree, or they, you know, they just die. There's a syndrome called dead in bed syndrome, okay? And it's a recognized condition where diabetics don't wake up in the morning, okay? And by that time, things get pretty much normalized, and you can't say, well, his insulin was up. There's no way to assign it to anything. So I think it's really tied into hypoglycemia. Now, people who need insulin don't want to get their blood glucose under really good control, because if it goes a little too low, they're going to have this problem. You know, what if you're sitting in class and you have a hypoglycemic event, okay? You lose cognitive function, you don't know what to tell people, you know, people don't want that to happen out in public, and they don't want to go around and, you know, they have responsible jobs and stuff, they can't have this happening, right? So hypoglycemia is what most diabetics fear the most. It has an immediate life-threatening consequence. hyperglycemia, where it's too high, okay, that's got a big long-term problem, but you're not going to die in the next hour from that, right? So people are saying, okay, I'm going to move my set point up a little bit, so I'll never get close to hypoglycemia, and go through life that way. Most diabetics operate that way. Anyway, so if you had hypoglycemia warning, you know, your sensor's going to tell you, okay, pal, you're pretty close, you know, oh, you're going down now, you know, alarm go off, that kind of thing. It'll be a big deal. I emphasize that for type 1 diabetics, the estimate is that twice a night during sleep, people go into hypoglycemia states where it gets between 60 and 40. And this is thought to occur in all type 1 diabetics, okay? And this was determined by my friend at Stanford. He has a summer camp where he takes the kids, diabetic kids to summer camp, right? And he teaches them how to do all their finger sticking and all that stuff, right? And then he takes a video of them while they're sleeping in their tents at night, okay, all night long. And these kids go into hypoglycemia and you can't wake up. I mean, they're just snoozing away deeply. And you get below 40, then you start into the shaking effect. You know, the whole body starts shaking and so on. And then, you know, their glucose might rise, and they wake up in the morning and say, oh, that was a lousy night's sleep. My air mattress is no good or something, you know. All kids do that. Yeah. And this wasn't known 5 years ago, okay? This is extremely bad news to parents. So, you know, you can imagine you have a kid sleeping in the other room. A lot of parents, diabetic children, take turns, okay? You watch the kid tonight, I'm going to sleep, you know, okay, tomorrow night's your turn. And, you know, I had a friend in my office just a couple weeks ago, pretty rich guy. He said, oh, we hired a nanny, and she starts working at 8 o'clock at night, and she stops at 6 in the morning. And her job is just to sit there and look at that kid. Right? And he said it was the biggest wise spending thing he's ever done, because he could get a decent night's sleep for that. Yeah. So hypoglycemia is a big issue.
So the shaking is like the first symptom in this?
Yeah, it's pretty far into the shaking. You know, that's a neurological syndrome.
No, I'm just wondering what you watch for the kid. You watch for the shaking.
Yeah, that they see the kid shaking.
And then the nanny would inject some insulin or something?
Well, the nanny,
Yeah.
the nanny strategy, I'm sure she's got instructions of what to do and how to, you know, she probably goes and tests the kid a couple of times a night and that kind of stuff, right? I don't know what the instructions are for them. That's the algorithm part, right? How do you fix this problem, right? Your instructions.
What is specifically the middle limit? Is that anything to do with circadian rhythms, or?
Well, most people eat a big meal, and then that's fine. Your glucose is pretty high for a while, but then it starts going down as it absorbs. So maybe 4 hours after a big meal is when things start going downhill. So that's the typical way. So if you had a sensor, you could alert. You know, the parents can sleep. The biggest selling point for making a sensor is for parents. Oh, I can sleep now. You know, this thing's going to go off and wake me up. Won't wake the kid up, you know, but I'll run in there and I can go through the night and not, okay. You could, of course, do insulin dosing. You know, you're going to adjust your insulin levels based on your existing blood glucose level and fuss with that and so on. And of course, it can run an artificial pancreas. If you have type 2 diabetes, you can do real-time glucose monitoring and you know, medication dosing. Most type 2s don't take insulin, but they still take oral medications, and many of them are over-medicated, you know, and you could adjust this, and you can adjust it based on your exercise level and your meal schedule and all that kind of thing. Most of us don't know what a meal does to our blood glucose. You know, if I give you a pizza and say, okay, what do you think your glucose level is going to do if you eat that, right? I don't know, but I know it's going to go up. I mean, but I don't know exactly how long and all this kind of thing. Most of us have no idea about that kind of stuff, right? It would be educational to know that, right? Big time. I think that's a tremendous value. There's a condition called gestational diabetes. These are pregnant women who have hyperglycemia most of the time during the pregnancy, and the result is the baby is usually on average 12 pounds. Okay? And there's a high rate of spontaneous abortions. They don't make it to full term and so on. And these women often revert to normal after the delivery, but about a third of them remain diabetic after the delivery. Okay? So fetal weight management can be done with this. I mean, you can adjust how much you're going to eat, right, and where you're at and all that stuff. Now, there's a large number of people out there we call pre-diabetics, and we don't know for sure if they're going to be diabetics or any of that kind of stuff, right? But they're defined as pre-diabetics because they have 2 diabetic parents, right? And so people are proposing, well, if you use the sensor, you could, you know, when that person starts to become frank diabetic, you could start treating them much sooner and maybe preserve some of their islets and, you know, change their behavior of eating, and, you know, there's all kinds of ways that might work to postpone or prevent diabetes.
Are pre-diabetic symptoms more prevalent among type 1 or 2, or is it pretty equal across the
Type 1 is pretty common, yeah. But type 2s, it's usually later. You know, type 1 is like 10, 12-year-old kid, right? But usually in type 2 is age 30 or something like that. So many people who have overweight parents are going to be candidates for type 2 diabetes. You know? Okay, body weight management, you know, this is a big item. Oh my goodness. Glucose response to specific foods, it'd be nice to know that. You could presumably use that information some way to avoid bulking out, right? And then there's this other very unfortunate problem called cachexia. These are people who can't put on body weight. There's a small fraction of the population, you know, they eat like crazy, but their liver works backwards and they can't actually, you know, I'm sure you don't know many people like that, but there are some. So a sensor would be good for those people. We could figure out how much eating and so on is needed. There's a big world of clinical care monitoring in diabetes. There was a study called the Vandenberg study about 7 or 8 years ago. This woman, Vandenberg, over in Europe, discovered that for any garden variety hospitalization, if you monitor that patient's glucose and adjust their glucose levels more carefully, you can shorten their hospital stay. Okay? When you go to the hospital in the old days, you say you're going to have your, I don't know what, your broken arm fixed or your leg repaired or something, right? Liver fixed. The doctor would say, okay, we've got to use anesthesia on this person. We don't want them to go into hypoglycemia while they're under anesthesia or anything like that, and if I don't monitor carefully enough, that might happen. So I'll just blast them with glucose, you know, at the start of the surgery. That's the way it used to be. Okay, we'll pump glucose level up to, you know, 300. We can work like crazy. There's not going to be any problem with this guy going hypoglycemic and dying because of that. And even if I don't monitor exactly perfectly, it won't be my fault because their glucose is so high. And the problem with that is, okay, after the patient wakes up, and oh my God, their glucose has been sustained high. Okay, call the diabetologist, and it's going to take a couple more days to get their glucose under control for anybody. Okay, so the alternative is if you monitor glucose very carefully and control and adjust, you can shorten the hospital stay. Okay, that's a big deal because that's tied into the financial costs of medicine and treatment and so on. If you just say, oh, you're going to be happier or something, that wouldn't work. You know, it's got to be, there's a tangible financial incentive to do this, right? So the Vandenberg study makes that pretty clear. And, you know, during childbirth, women who are borderline diabetics, it'd be great to know if you're over or any kind of surgery. You know, not for diabetics, but just anybody. Okay. And then all these other therapies I'm going to mention shortly here, or maybe tomorrow. Alternatives to the mechanical version, like islets and transplants and stem cells and stuff like that. You could use a sensor in conjunction with that. In fact, you may need to have a sensor on board to get under control before you actually use these other therapies so that they won't be such a big challenge when they start their action and so on. There's a bunch of other stuff, but I'll tell you about tomorrow. I'm going to stop, okay? So where I'm at so far is just, I'm going through this big harangue just to set up the problem. Why is this such a, it's an enormous problem, it's a growing problem, okay? Those are big red flags. And the mechanism of it's been known since 1921, you know, and you shouldn't, if anything, it should have been erased a long time ago, right? But it's exactly the opposite worldwide. And this is what I call a worthy problem. This is worth doing something about it if you can figure out what to do. This is one of the candidates that would make a lot of sense. So that's one of the things you want to do when you're starting your career into medical device, and you want to make sure that, you know, what you're working on has really got a rationale behind it. You know, it's really clear that this will be useful if you can just make it, you know. And the rationale is, this is such a strong rationale at this point. So not all things have to be this strong. I'm not saying this is a model for everything, okay? But I'm just saying this is one example of a flagrant problem that really needs some attention and really needs some kind of a fix. And it has needed it for, you know, decades. And I'll tell you about some possible fixes next time. Okay. So we're going to meet tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock.
Is that our plan?
Coffee will be here.
Okay. Before we go, look at this handout I made here. Okay. The first thing I call session 1 is picking a worthy problem. I told you about all these events having to do with diabetes. There's a reading assignment, okay? And there's recent articles from the New York Times. There's a whole series, about 20 articles that appear on the front page of the New York Times 2 years ago. And I've copied 3 of them, and they're in your packet, okay? One is called Diabetes and Its Awful Toll Quietly Emerges a Crisis, okay? And, you know, I have the actual fancier version here, but this is in your packet someplace. And, you know, this is the way you can tell when you're reading New York Times. This is the guy because it appears in that corner of the front page. And so, you know, I think you'd be surprised at that. And then I'd like you to read this other article that's in your packet, just to make sure that you realize this isn't just for people in New York City, okay? Right? East meets West, this is about people who immigrated from China or India, same thing, come to the U.S., and whereas they didn't have diabetes when they were in China and India, suddenly they come to the U.S. and you know what?
That's out here.
Yeah. And then there's another article in there that says that 1 in 8 people in New York City have diabetes. There's a stunning statement in one of those that says, you know, New York City keeps the most detailed medical records of their hospital usage. You know, they've had to do this for a long time, right? So they know how many hospital beds are available, how many people they need to be able to serve, all that kind of stuff. Almost no other place keeps records like that. So they projected that, I think it's 2030, the year 2030, at the present rate of increase in diabetes, every hospital bed in New York City will be occupied by a diabetic. Unless something otherwise happens, right? And of course there are other diseases too, right? But I mean, it's just, anyway, these articles give you sort of a little broader perspective of how, you know, they're great articles to read, and I'd like you to take a look at those. And that's about as far as we've got so far. Next time we'll have some kind of discussion and various things. So you can take a look at that, and I'll get on to how we're gonna fix this, my version of it, okay, tomorrow.
Okay. And begin thinking too about other areas in addition to what we outlined in the syllabus that you have at this point.
Yeah, that's the other part of the assignment. Anything else that we may not be covering that is your favorite topic, you know, that we're happy to try to adjust our schedule. Did you have a question?
One real quick question. I just didn't understand, or I don't understand, the disease progression leads to amputation. Is it like neuropathy and then
Yeah, the typical, why do you need amputation? Well, these are long-term diabetics. Typical outcome is, you know, they've had nerve damage, and when I used to live in New England, the idea was, okay, you come in on a big snowy day and put your foot up on the radiator, go to sleep. 2 hours later, there's this funny smell. Oh, my foot's on fire. You know, oh, there's a big sore on the bottom of your foot. A lot of diabetics have these big plantar ulcers that are just open sores, unresolved sores, and they lead to gangrene. Okay, And the only, so they start chopping away. That's what happens, right? And,
So wasn't sure.
no, so that's the story. Okay. Okay, well, we're seeing, well, I'll continue on here.
Okay, we just finished. Everybody, this is Steve Lopez. who
The guy
is-
with the card.
Right?
Oh, this is the base.
Yeah.
That's hard.
And Steve is the MSO from bioengineering, so you may get communications from him at times.
And if anything, if you have any questions about facilities or anything like that, you can always call me. I may not have the answer, but I certainly know where to point you. Okay.
And if anybody's, are you still interested in showing people around?
No, everybody, how many people